Bullets tore through the autumn air, shattering the reinforced glass of Chicago's most exclusive cafe. People screamed, scrambling for cover, but former Marine Cullen Patterson didn't run. Training kicked in. He launched himself across the marble floor, shielding a terrified woman in a designer coat with his own body as concrete exploded around them. He thought he was saving a helpless civilian. He had no idea the woman trembling beneath him held the entire city in her hands. The biting wind off Lake Michigan whipped down the concrete canyons of the Loop, carrying the bitter promise of another brutal Chicago winter. For 32-year-old Cullen Patterson, the cold was merely an inconvenience compared to the crushing weight of his reality. Cullen adjusted the collar of his worn surplus jacket, his boots hitting the pavement with the measured, rhythmic cadence of a man who had spent a decade marching across the unforgiving deserts of the Middle East. He was a former Force Recon Marine, highly decorated, honorably discharged, and currently failing at the most important mission of his life, providing for his 6-year-old daughter, Lena. The morning had started like every other in their cramped, drafty apartment in Pilsen. Cullen had woken up at 400 hours, a lingering habit from his deployments, and stared at the ceiling, doing the brutal mental math of poverty. Rent was 12 days past due. The electric bill was threatening a shut-off notice. And Lena's winter coat was getting too tight, the sleeves riding up her small wrists. His wife, Sarah, had passed away from aggressively late-stage ovarian cancer 2 years ago, a tragedy that had drained not only his soul, but every cent of their savings and his military severance. He had left Lena at her elementary school with a warm hug, a forced smile, and a promise that Daddy was going to get a great new job today. He had lied. The interview at a downtown logistics firm had been a humiliating disaster. The hiring manager, a soft-handed man in a tailored suit, had looked over Cullen's resume with thinly veiled condescension. "You have an impressive military record, Mr. Patterson, but commanding a squad under fire doesn't exactly translate to managing our regional supply chains. We're looking for someone with more corporate synergy." Cullen had swallowed his pride, nodded respectfully, and walked out into the freezing November air. His shoulder, reconstructed after an IED blast in Helmand Province, ached with the cold. He had $14 in his checking account. The VA benefits were stalled in a bureaucratic purgatory, and the temp agencies weren't calling back. He was a man who knew how to dismantle a weapon blindfolded, how to survive for weeks in hostile territory. But the civilian world felt like a maze with no exit. Seeking a temporary reprieve from the biting wind before his long L-train ride home, Cullen ducked into an upscale espresso bar on Michigan Avenue. The place smelled of roasted beans, vanilla, and the quiet arrogance of wealth. He ordered the cheapest black coffee on the menu, wrapping his calloused hands around the paper cup to siphon its heat. He retreated to a small stool near the back, pulling a folded crayon drawing from his pocket. It was a picture Lena had drawn of the two of them, a lopsided stick-figure father holding hands with a smaller stick-figure daughter under a bright yellow sun. He stared at the drawing, a heavy lump forming in his throat. He was drowning, and he didn't know how to keep his little girl above water much longer. As Cullen sat there, lost in the suffocating quiet of his own desperation, the front doors of the cafe opened, letting in a gust of wind and a woman who immediately commanded the atmosphere of the room. She was flanked by a broad-shouldered man wearing an ill-fitting suit, a bodyguard. Cullen's trained eyes noted instantly. The man's eyes darted around, but his posture was slightly relaxed, betraying a lack of elite training. The woman, however, was a different story entirely. She looked to be in her early 30s, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal trench coat over a midnight blue dress that screamed old money and ruthless ambition. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek, no-nonsense style, framing a face that was strikingly beautiful but hardened by an invisible pressure. She was speaking rapidly into a cell phone, her voice carrying a crisp, authoritative edge that cut through the low murmur of the cafe. "I don't care what the board says, Richard," she snapped into the phone, pacing near the front window, overlooking the avenue. "The Harrison merger goes through on my terms, or I gut their entire executive team by Friday. Tell them to back down, or I'll bury them." Cullen took a sip of his coffee, turning his gaze away to give her privacy. Rich people problems. They seemed so trivial, so disconnected from the visceral reality of survival. But Cullen's instincts, the hypervigilance ingrained in him by years of urban combat, suddenly flared. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The ambient noise of the street outside seemed to mute. Through the massive pane of reinforced glass, Cullen saw it. A sleek, unmarked black SUV had pulled up to the curb, idling just a few yards from where the woman was standing. It wasn't a taxi, and it wasn't a rideshare. The rear passenger window rolled down smoothly, revealing the cold, matte black steel of a suppressed submachine gun resting on the doorframe. Time slowed to a crawl. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, processed in Cullen's brain in a fraction of a millisecond. The bodyguard was looking at the barista. The woman was staring at her phone. "Get down!" Cullen roared, his voice a concussive blast that silenced the cafe. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. Cullen dropped his coffee and exploded off his stool, his legs driving him forward with explosive power. The first suppressed shots sounded like the violent snapping of thick branches. Thwip, 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 thwip. The reinforced glass window didn't shatter. It spiderwebbed and blew inward, raining sharp, deadly diamonds over the tables. Cullen hit the woman at full speed, just as the air where she had been standing was filled with lethal lead. He wrapped his arms around her, twisting in mid-air to take the brunt of the impact, and slammed them both hard onto the polished marble floor. Chaos erupted. Patrons screamed, diving under tables. Coffee cups exploded, and pastry displays shattered into dust. The bodyguard fumbled for his weapon, but a precise burst of fire caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground with a cry of pain. Cullen scrambled, hooking his arm under the terrified woman's waist, dragging her behind the solid concrete and oak base of the barista counter. Bullets chewed into the wood above their heads, sending splinters cascading over them. "Keep your head down. Do not move," Cullen ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the slaughter. The woman was trembling violently, her phone shattered on the floor, her wide eyes locked onto Cullen. What is happening?" she gasped, struggling to breathe under the weight of his arm pressing her down. "Targeted hit," Cullen replied coldly. He peeked around the edge of the counter, his eyes tracking the vehicle. He had no weapon, no armor. He mentally calculated the angles. The shooters were laying down suppressing fire, likely preparing to dismount and finish the job. Not today, Cullen thought. He grabbed a heavy metal napkin dispenser from the floor and, with picture-perfect accuracy, hurled it over the counter directly at the shattered window. The metallic clatter drew the shooter's fire for a split second. In that fraction of a moment, Cullen noted the SUV's tires squealing. The element of surprise was gone. Sirens were already wailing in the distance. The Chicago Police Department had cruisers permanently stationed at the nearby intersection. Realizing their window of opportunity had closed, the shooters didn't dismount. The SUV's engine roared, tires biting into the asphalt, and the vehicle tore away from the curb, vanishing into the dense city traffic. Silence fell over the cafe, broken only by the whimpering of terrified patrons and the groans of the wounded bodyguard. Cullen stayed low, waiting a full 10 seconds before slowly rising to a knee. The immediate threat was gone. He looked down at the woman. Her expensive coat was covered in dust and glass shards, but she was entirely unharmed. "You're clear," Cullen said, his voice flat. He offered a calloused hand. She stared at his hand, then at his face, her chest heaving. Slowly, she took it, allowing him to pull her to her feet. As she stood, she looked at the shattered cafe, the bleeding bodyguard, and finally back to the rugged, stoic man who had just risked his life for a total stranger. "You're bleeding," she whispered, pointing. Cullen glanced down. A sharp sting registered in his upper left arm. A ricochet fragment or a shard of high-velocity glass had sliced through his jacket, leaving a dark, spreading stain of crimson on his sleeve. "I'm fine," Cullen muttered, brushing the glass off his clothes. He heard the heavy boots of uniformed officers rushing through the doors, shouting commands. The scene was about to become a bureaucratic nightmare of statements, interrogations, and delays. Lena was getting out of school in 3 hours. He couldn't afford to be trapped in a police precinct all afternoon. He turned toward the back exit. "Wait," the woman called out, stepping forward. "Who are you? You saved my life." "Just a guy getting a coffee," Cullen said, not looking back. He pushed through the emergency exit doors, disappearing into the cold, chaotic alleyway of Chicago. Cullen didn't make it far. The adrenaline dump left him dizzy, and the cut on his arm was deeper than he had initially thought. By the time he reached the L-train station, the blood had soaked through his jacket, drawing horrified stares from the commuters. Realizing he couldn't pick up his daughter looking like he had just crawled out of a war zone, he reluctantly diverted to a nearby urgent care clinic, which promptly called an ambulance. The protocol for gunshot-related injuries was strict. 2 hours later, Cullen sat on a sterile bed in the emergency room of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. A weary doctor had stitched up his arm, 4 neat sutures to close the gash caused by a jagged piece of shrapnel. "You're lucky, Mr. Patterson," the doctor said, wrapping a white bandage around the bicep. "An inch to the right, and it would have nicked the brachial artery. The police are waiting outside to take your statement." "I need to go," Cullen said gruffly, looking at the clock on the wall. It was 2:30 p.m. My daughter's school lets out at 3. I have to be there." "I'm afraid you can't leave just yet." A smooth, authoritative voice echoed from the doorway. Cullen looked up. Standing in the entrance of his cubicle was the woman from the cafe. She had cleaned up. The ruined trench coat was gone, replaced by a pristine blazer. Flanking her were 2 men in dark suits who radiated quiet, lethal competence, a massive upgrade from the bodyguard who had gotten shot earlier. The doctor looked annoyed. "Excuse me, miss, this is a restricted area." "Give us the room, doctor," the woman said. It wasn't a request. It was an eviction notice. One of the men in suits calmly stepped forward, holding the door open. Intimidated by the sheer force of her presence, the doctor muttered something under his breath and hurried out. The woman stepped into the room, her piercing blue eyes locking onto Cullen. "The police outside have been instructed to delay your questioning until I've spoken with you," she said, her voice smooth but carrying the weight of absolute power. "Furthermore, my people have already arranged for a private car to pick up your daughter, Lena, from school. She is currently safely accompanied by a female security agent and is enjoying a hot chocolate in the back of an armored Maybach." Cullen's blood turned to ice. In a fraction of a second, his demeanor shifted from a tired father to a lethal operator. He slipped off the hospital bed, closing the distance between them, ignoring the sudden tensing of her security detail. "If you or your people touch my daughter," Cullen growled, his voice low and dangerous, "I will dismantle this entire hospital to get to you." The security guards stepped forward, reaching inside their jackets, but the woman held up a single manicured hand, stopping them instantly. She didn't flinch. She met Cullen's furious gaze with absolute calm. "I apologize, Mr. Patterson," she said softly. "That came out sounding like a threat. It wasn't. It was logistics. I know who you are. I know you're a single father, a former Force Recon Marine. I know you were wounded in Helmand. I know your wife passed away. And I know you are currently 3 months behind on your rent in Pilsen." Cullen froze, his jaw tight. Who the hell are you? She extended her hand. My name is Vienna Lopez, CEO of Lopez Enterprises. Cullen didn't take her hand. He knew the name. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. Lopez Enterprises owned half the commercial real estate in the city, holding stakes in international shipping, tech development, and private defense contracting. She didn't just have money. She had the kind of wealth that influenced legislation and dictated the skyline. Why are you here, Ms. Lopez? Cullen asked, stepping back slightly but keeping his guard up. Vienna lowered her hand, her expression hardening. The Chicago Police Department is currently treating the incident at the cafe as a random act of gang violence, a drive-by shooting that got out of hand. They are wrong, and they are either incompetent or paid to look the other way. She stepped closer to Cullen, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That hit was ordered by members of my own board of directors. I recently uncovered massive financial irregularities, billions being funneled into offshore shell companies tied to international cartels. Tomorrow morning I am scheduled to hand the evidence over to the Department of Justice. The people I work with know this. They are trying to silence me. Cullen crossed his arms, wincing slightly as the stitches pulled. Sounds like you need better bodyguards, not my problem. My security chief was compromised, Vienna stated plainly. The man who was shot today was a plant. He intentionally left me exposed. Everyone on my payroll has been vetted, but I can no longer trust a single one of them. The men outside the door, I pay them well, but if my board offers them triple, they'll put a bullet in the back of my head before we reach the parking garage. She looked at Cullen, and for the first time, he saw a crack in her impenetrable armor. He saw genuine, raw fear. But you, she continued, her voice softening, you threw yourself over a complete stranger. You had no armor, no weapon, and nothing to gain. You are a man of honor, Mr. Patterson. In my world, honor is a currency that doesn't exist. Get to the point, Cullen said. I need a shadow, Vienna said. I need someone by my side for the next 72 hours. Someone who isn't on my payroll, someone the board doesn't know, someone who can't be bought. I need you to keep me alive until I reach the federal courthouse on Friday morning. Cullen shook his head. I'm not a mercenary. I'm a father. I have a little girl who needs me to come home. I stepped in today because it was reflex. I'm not diving into a corporate war. Vienna reached into her blazer and pulled out a sleek black envelope. She tossed it onto the hospital bed. Inside that envelope is a cashier's check for $1 million, she said smoothly. Clean, untraceable, and legally gifted. That is for your services for the next 3 days. Regardless of what happens, your daughter's college tuition is paid for. Your medical bills, your rent, your debts, gone. Cullen stared at the black envelope. $1 million. It was an unfathomable amount of money. It meant a safe neighborhood for Lena. It meant never having to choose between heat and groceries again. It meant freedom. But it also meant putting himself in the crosshairs of highly trained killers. If they missed today, Cullen said slowly, looking from the envelope to her eyes, they will send professionals tonight. They won't miss twice. Which is why I need a professional to stop them, Vienna replied. She stepped back toward the door. My car is downstairs. Your daughter is safe, and we have a secure penthouse suite locked down at the Four Seasons. The choice is yours, Cullen. Walk away, go back to your life, and I will likely be dead by midnight. Or pick up that envelope and change your daughter's life forever. Cullen looked at his bruised, scarred hands. He thought of the empty refrigerator, the stack of overdue bills, and the lopsided drawing of the father and daughter holding hands in the sun. He wasn't a hero anymore. But he was a father, and a father did whatever it took to protect his own. With a heavy sigh, Cullen reached down and picked up the black envelope. He looked at Vienna Lopez, the billionaire who had just bought his life. We leave through the service elevator, Cullen commanded, his voice shifting back into the cold, calculated tone of a Marine commander. Those suits outside? Leave them here. From this second on, no one knows where we are. Understood? A faint, relieved smile touched Vienna's lips. "Understood, Mr. Patterson. Lead the way." The service elevator of the Four Seasons moved with a terrifyingly smooth silence, rocketing them toward the 65th floor. Cullen stood rigidly in front of Vienna Lopez, his eyes locked on the digital floor indicator, his body angled to shield her from the doors the moment they opened. When the metal doors finally parted, they revealed a private foyer adorned with imported Italian marble and abstract sculptures that cost more than Cullen's lifetime earnings. But Cullen didn't see art. He saw cover, concealment, and fatal funnels. "Stay behind me," Cullen murmured, stepping out. He moved through the sprawling 5,000-square-foot penthouse with the predatory grace of a man clearing a hostile compound in Fallujah. He checked the sightlines through the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline. He secured the secondary exits, deadbolted the heavy oak doors, and drew the heavy blackout curtains across the glass, instantly cutting off any line of sight from neighboring high-rises. Only when he was satisfied that the perimeter was temporarily secure did he allow himself to breathe. He turned toward the living room, where a plush velvet sofa dominated the space. Sitting on it, her small legs swinging over the edge, was Lena. She was clutching a half-empty cup of gourmet hot chocolate, her eyes wide as she took in the opulent surroundings. Standing next to her was a female security contractor in a sharp suit, who looked relieved to see Vienna walk through the door. "Daddy!" Lena squealed, dropping the cup onto a glass coaster and launching herself across the room. Cullen knelt, catching his daughter in a tight embrace, burying his face in her soft hair. The scent of her strawberry shampoo grounded him, pulling him back from the icy, tactical headspace he had been forced into. "Are you okay, Bug?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I got to ride in a car that had a television inside it," Lena said, her eyes shining with innocence. "And that lady said you got a new job helping her." Cullen swallowed hard, glancing over Lena's shoulder at Vienna. The billionaire CEO was watching them, a strange, unreadable expression softening her normally severe features. "That's right, sweetheart," Cullen said, forcing a smile as he stood up, keeping Lena close to his side. He looked at the female contractor. "You can go. Take the service elevator down to the basement, leave through the loading dock, and throw your company phone in the river. If anyone asks, you lost us in traffic." The contractor looked at Vienna for confirmation. Vienna gave a curt nod. "Do as he says, Maria. You will receive a generous severance in your offshore account by morning. Disappear for a few days." Once they were alone, the silence of the penthouse felt suffocating. Cullen turned to Vienna, his demeanor shifting back to stone. "We need ground rules, Ms. Lopez. If I'm keeping you alive, I'm in charge of security. No phone calls, no Wi-Fi. Your board of directors clearly has the resources to track cellular triangulation and digital footprints. From this second forward, you are a ghost." Vienna walked over to a wet bar, pouring herself a neat glass of scotch. Her hands had a slight tremor, a rare physical betrayal of the immense stress she was under. "My Chief Operating Officer, Richard Hawthorne," Vienna said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. "He's the one pulling the strings. He's been laundering money for the Sinaloa cartel through our overseas shipping subsidiaries. When I found the discrepancies in the ledgers 3 weeks ago, I initiated a quiet internal audit. I thought I had time to build a waterproof case for the DOJ." She let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "I underestimated his ruthlessness. Hawthorne isn't just a corporate shark. He's backed by men who solve their problems with lead and explosives. If I don't walk into the federal courthouse on Friday at 9 a.m. with that encrypted drive, he takes control of the company and the evidence vanishes." "Where is the drive?" Cullen asked. "In a biometric lockbox at my primary bank downtown," she replied. "I need to retrieve it tomorrow, and then we have to survive until Friday morning." Cullen rubbed his temples, the dull ache of exhaustion creeping in. It was Wednesday night. 36 hours to keep the most wanted woman in Chicago alive against a corporate-funded hit squad. "Daddy?" Lena tugged at his sleeve. "I'm hungry." Before Cullen could respond, Vienna set her glass down and walked toward the massive, state-of-the-art kitchen. "I believe there are truffled mac and cheese provisions in the Sub-Zero refrigerator," she said, her voice softer than Cullen had heard it yet. "Let's see if a CEO can figure out how to operate a microwave, shall we?" For the next hour, Cullen watched a surreal scene unfold. Vienna Lopez, a woman who routinely dismantled billion-dollar corporations before lunch, sat cross-legged on a Persian rug, eating macaroni with a 6-year-old girl. Lena chattered endlessly about her school art projects, entirely oblivious to the lethal stakes surrounding them. Vienna listened intently, occasionally asking questions, her icy exterior melting under the warmth of the child's absolute innocence. But Cullen couldn't relax. He paced the perimeter, checking the locks, watching the security feeds on the internal monitor, and planning their egress routes. He knew men like Hawthorne. They didn't just hire street thugs. If the first hit failed, they would escalate. They would bring in professionals. And professionals didn't knock. By 2 a.m., the city below was a sprawling grid of silent, glittering lights. Lena had fallen asleep in the master bedroom, buried under a mountain of down comforters. Vienna was on the sofa in the living room, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Her eyes closed, but her breathing too shallow for deep sleep. Cullen sat in the dark near the foyer, perfectly still. The only illumination came from the ambient city glow bleeding through the edges of the blackout curtains. He had wrapped his wounded arm tightly to stop the bleeding, the dull throb serving as a constant reminder to stay sharp. He had no firearms. His only weapon was a heavy carbon steel chef's knife he had taken from the kitchen, currently resting on his thigh. It was a severe tactical disadvantage, but a Force Recon Marine's primary weapon was always his mind. At 2:14 a.m., the subtle hum of the penthouse's central HVAC unit sputtered, then died. Cullen's eyes snapped open. The silence in the room deepened. 30 seconds later, the green indicator light on the digital thermostat on the wall flickered and went dark. "Power cut. Localized to the penthouse." "They're here," Cullen thought. He didn't shout. He moved with absolute silence, gliding across the thick carpet to where Vienna was resting. He clamped a hand over her mouth, pressing down firmly but gently. Vienna jolted, her eyes wide with panic, but Cullen leaned in close, his lips barely touching her ear. "Do not make a sound," he breathed. "They cut the power. We have company. Stay low. Crawl to the master bedroom, get under the bed with Lena, and do not come out until I say your name." He felt her nod against his palm. He released her, and Vienna slipped off the sofa, crawling silently towards the hallway, a shadow disappearing into the darkness. Cullen turned his attention back to the foyer. He knew how tactical teams operated. They would bypass the heavy front doors. Too much noise, too well fortified. They would use the service elevator or rappel from the roof to the balcony. A faint metallic click echoed from the service entrance in the kitchen. Lockpicks, high-end electric tension tools. Cullen moved into the kitchen, pressing his back against the marble island, gripping the chef's knife. The ambient light from the city caught the polished steel of the blade. He slowed his breathing, visualizing the layout, calculating the angles of attack. The service door opened with a soft swoosh. 2 figures stepped into the kitchen. They were clad entirely in black tactical gear, wearing panoramic night vision goggles. They moved with fluid, lethal precision. No wasted motion, rifles shouldered and sweeping the room. These weren't cartel thugs. They were highly trained private military contractors. PMCs. Cullen had a distinct disadvantage. They could see in the dark, and they were heavily armed. But Cullen knew the terrain, and he knew they would expect a panicked civilian, not an apex predator waiting in ambush. The first contractor stepped past the marble island, his suppressed short-barreled rifle panning left. Cullen exploded from the shadows. He didn't go for a strike. He went for control. With his right hand, Cullen grabbed the searing hot suppressor of the contractor's rifle, violently shoving the muzzle toward the ceiling. Simultaneously, he drove the pommel of the heavy chef's knife directly into the side of the man's neck, just below the helmet line. The contractor gurgled, dropping like a stone, the rifle slipping from his grasp. The second contractor reacted instantly, spinning toward the commotion, his finger tightening on the trigger. Thwip, thwip, thwip! 3 suppressed rounds chewed into the marble island where Cullen had been a fraction of a second prior. But Cullen was already moving. He scooped up the fallen contractor's rifle from the floor, rolled across the polished hardwood, and fired 2 precise, controlled bursts from his hip. The rounds struck the second contractor's center mass, the kinetic energy throwing him backward against the stainless steel refrigerator. He slumped to the floor, motionless. Silence descended upon the kitchen, broken only by the smell of ozone and cordite, and the heavy, ragged breathing of the first contractor struggling to breathe on the floor. Cullen didn't hesitate. He stripped the night vision goggles off the second man, secured his spare magazines, and checked the chamber of the stolen rifle. It was an HK-416, modified for close-quarters combat, a very expensive, very illegal weapon for a civilian to possess in Chicago. Hawthorne had deep pockets. He moved quickly back to the master bedroom, the rifle raised, scanning the shadows. "Vienna," Cullen said softly, entering the room. From beneath the massive king-sized bed, Vienna scrambled out, clutching a terrified, crying Lena to her chest. Vienna's composure was completely shattered. She was trembling, her pristine clothes wrinkled, her eyes wide with unfiltered terror. "Are they?" she stammered. "Dead or incapacitated," Cullen said bluntly, switching the safety on the rifle but keeping it at the low ready. "But they were a probe, a 2-man advance team to test our defenses. When they don't check in on their comms in 3 minutes, the main assault team is going to breach this floor from every angle." Lena buried her face in Cullen's leg, sobbing. "Daddy, I want to go home. I'm scared." Cullen dropped to a knee, pulling Lena into a tight, one-armed hug. He kissed the top of her head, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. "I know, Bug. I know. I'm right here. Daddy's not going to let anything happen to you. I promise." He looked up at Vienna. The billionaire was staring at the rifle in his hands, then at his blood-stained jacket. The reality of her corporate war had finally crashed down upon her in all its visceral, bloody horror. All her money, all her influence, meant absolutely nothing in this room. The only thing keeping her breathing was the scarred, desperate father kneeling before her. "The penthouse is compromised," Cullen stated, his voice devoid of emotion, shifting fully into command mode. "We can't stay here. If we get pinned down on the 65th floor, we're dead." "Where do we go?" Vienna asked, her voice cracking. "They control the building. They likely have the lobby locked down." "We go down," Cullen said, grabbing a heavy winter coat from the closet and wrapping it around Lena. "But we don't use the stairs. And we don't use the elevators. We're going to have to improvise. Grab your shoes, Ms. Lopez. We're going off the grid." The freezing wind howled against the reinforced glass of the penthouse terrace, a bitter reminder of the hostile environment waiting outside. Cullen shoved the heavy sliding doors open, the sudden rush of glacial air instantly biting through their clothing. Below them, the city of Chicago was a dizzying abyss of concrete and streetlights, plunging 65 stories into the dark. "Out," Cullen ordered, his voice cutting through the wind. Vienna hesitated at the threshold, staring down at the fatal drop. Her hands were white-knuckled, gripping the doorframe. "Cullen, there is nothing out there but empty air." "Look up," Cullen said, stepping onto the terrace and keeping his stolen HK-416 rifle leveled at the hallway. Suspended just above the terrace railing, swaying slightly in the powerful crosswinds, was a heavy-duty window-washing gondola. It was locked into its maintenance cradle for the night. To a civilian, it was a piece of industrial equipment. To a Force Recon Marine trapped in a kill zone, it was an extraction vehicle. "I need you to climb over the railing and get into the basket," Cullen said, his eyes scanning the shadows inside the penthouse. He could hear the faint, synchronized thud of heavy boots vibrating through the floorboards. The main assault team was moving up the emergency stairwells. The 3-minute window was closing fast. Vienna swallowed hard, her terror momentarily overriding her authority. I can't. I'm terrified of heights." "Vienna," Cullen snapped, his voice sharp enough to draw her gaze away from the drop. He met her panicked eyes with a look of absolute, unshakable resolve. "Hawthorne's men are 30 seconds away. If they breach this room, they will execute you. And then they will execute my daughter because she is a witness. Get in the basket." The mention of Lena snapped something into place inside the billionaire CEO. The panic in her eyes hardened into a desperate, feral courage. She nodded once, a tight, jerky movement. She grabbed the metal railing, hauling herself over the edge, her designer dress snagging and tearing on the cold aluminum. She dropped heavily into the metal-grated basket, immediately crouching low. "Daddy, it's cold," Lena whimpered, shivering violently in the oversized winter coat Cullen had wrapped her in. "I know, Bug, I know," Cullen said, hoisting her up with his good arm. He handed her over the railing to Vienna. "Hold her tight. Do not let go, no matter what happens." Vienna wrapped her arms around the little girl, burying Lena's face against her shoulder to shield her from the terrifying view of the street below. Cullen vaulted over the railing, just as the heavy oak doors of the penthouse foyer exploded inward with a deafening roar. A concussive blast rocked the living room, followed instantly by the blinding white flash of a stun grenade. The assault team was in. Cullen didn't waste a second. He dropped into the basket and reached up to the control box mounted on the suspension rig. It was padlocked and secured with heavy chains. Cursing under his breath, Cullen flipped the HK-416 around, pressed the muzzle directly against the thick brass padlock, and pulled the trigger. The suppressed shot snapped, and the lock shattered into jagged shrapnel. Cullen ripped the control panel open, his fingers flying over the manual release valves. He didn't bother trying to hotwire the electrical descent. He grabbed the emergency manual brake release, a heavy red lever, and pulled it hard. The mechanical winch shrieked in protest. The gears slipped, and the gondola dropped like a stone. Vienna screamed, clutching Lena as the bottom fell out of their world. They free fell for 2 terrifying seconds before Cullen slammed the brake lever halfway back up, catching the suspension cables. The gondola jerked violently, throwing them all against the cold metal railing, but the descent slowed to a rapid, controlled slide down the glass face of the skyscraper. Above them, on the terrace they had just evacuated, 3 tactical operators rushed to the railing. Laser sights painted the night air, slicing through the darkness. "Keep your heads down!" Cullen roared over the wind. He raised the rifle with one hand, resting the barrel on the edge of the gondola, and fired a rapid, suppressing burst upward. The bullets chewed into the concrete edge of the terrace, forcing the operators to duck. Crack, crack, crack. High-velocity rounds from the attackers rained down, shattering the glass panels of the skyscraper inches from where the gondola was descending. Shards of glass showered over them like lethal hail. Cullen kept one hand tight on the brake lever, feathering it to drop them faster, enduring the agonizing burn in his wounded shoulder. Floor numbers painted on the structural columns whipped past them in a blur. 50. 45. 40. "Where are we going?" Vienna shouted over the mechanical scream of the winches. "Floor 15, Cullen yelled back. "Mechanical exchange and parking garage access. It's our only blind spot." The cold was paralyzing, seeping into their bones. Lena was sobbing quietly into Vienna's chest, completely overwhelmed by the noise, the drop, and the freezing wind. Vienna kept one hand firmly pressed against the back of the little girl's head, whispering frantic promises that everything was going to be all right. 20, 18, 16. Cullen slammed the brake lever up, locking the gears. The gondola jolted to a violent, swinging halt, suspended outside a massive, louvered ventilation grate on the 15th floor. "Move," Cullen ordered. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and kicked the metal louvers of the ventilation shaft. They were bolted tight. He took a step back, raised his heavy combat boot, and drove his heel into the center of the grate with every ounce of his remaining strength. The rusted bolts sheared, and the heavy metal panel crashed inward, disappearing into the dark, mechanical room. He grabbed Lena, swinging her safely into the dusty, grease-scented darkness of the shaft, and then reached back for Vienna. She didn't hesitate this time. She grabbed his calloused hand, and he hauled her roughly into the building just as another volley of gunfire echoed from far above. They scrambled through the narrow mechanical duct, dropping down into a cavernous, dimly lit boiler room. The heat from the massive generators was a sudden, violent contrast to the freezing wind outside. Cullen didn't let them stop to catch their breath. He pushed through a heavy fire door, leading them directly into the 15th floor parking structure. It was a concrete labyrinth, filled with the luxury sedans and sports cars of the hotel's wealthiest guests. "We need a car," Vienna gasped, clutching a stitch in her side. "But the keys are all at the valet desk in the lobby. The men upstairs will have secured it." "We aren't using a valet," Cullen said. He scanned the dimly lit garage, his eyes passing over the Mercedes and Porsches until he found what he was looking for. A battered, 10-year-old Ford maintenance truck parked near a supply closet. It was analog, dirty, and practically invisible in a city like Chicago. Cullen smashed the driver's side window with the butt of his rifle, unlocked the door, and reached under the steering column. Decades of hot-wiring military surplus vehicles in the desert made short work of the Ford's ignition. Within 30 seconds, the engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. "Get in the floorboard of the back seat," Cullen instructed, throwing the truck into gear. "Keep Lena out of sight." As Vienna and Lena huddled in the back, Cullen slammed the accelerator. The truck tore through the parking garage, spiraling down the concrete ramps at reckless speeds. He smashed through the wooden exit barrier of the parking structure, the splintered wood flying over the hood, and merged violently into the late-night traffic of downtown Chicago. They were off the grid, but the hunt had only just begun. The industrial district of Pilsen was a graveyard of shuttered factories and rusting rail yards, a forgotten corner of the city where no one asked questions. Cullen navigated the stolen maintenance truck down a narrow, pothole-riddled alleyway, finally killing the headlights as he pulled up to a corrugated metal garage door marked O'Connor Auto. Cullen killed the engine, the sudden silence in the cab ringing in their ears. "Where are we?" Vienna whispered from the floorboard. She looked exhausted, her pristine blazer ruined, her hair wild and tangled. "A safe house," Cullen replied quietly. "Belongs to an old squad mate. He's running security logistics in Dubai for the year. He left me the keys in case I ever needed a place to turn wrenches. It's off the books, no digital footprint." He stepped out, manually unlocking the heavy padlock on the door and rolling it up just enough to ease the truck inside. Once the door was shut and bolted from the inside, Cullen flicked on a single dim work light hanging from the rafters. The garage smelled heavily of motor oil, stale tobacco, and dust. Cullen immediately went to work. He found a pile of clean moving blankets in a corner office and fashioned a makeshift bed on an old leather sofa. He gently lifted a sleeping Lena from the truck and laid her down, tucking the blankets tightly around her. He brushed a stray curl from her forehead, his chest tightening with a fierce, protective ache. She shouldn't be here. She should be in her own bed, dreaming about cartoons, not running from corporate assassins. She's incredibly brave, a quiet voice said behind him. Cullen turned. Vienna was standing in the doorway of the office, holding a dusty first aid kit she had found on a workbench. She looked at Cullen, and for the first time, the billionaire facade was completely gone. There was no arrogance, no commanding edge, just raw, human exhaustion and profound gratitude. She gets it from her mother, Cullen said softly, his eyes dropping to the concrete floor. Sit down, Vienna instructed, pointing to a metal folding chair. She opened the medical kit. You're bleeding through your bandages. If you bleed out, Lena and I are dead by sunrise. Let me help you. Cullen hesitated, then slowly stripped off his ruined surplus jacket and his blood-soaked t-shirt. The bullet graze on his shoulder had torn open during the descent, the stitches ripping through the muscle. Vienna inhaled sharply at the sight, but her hands were steady as she cleaned the wound with industrial antiseptic and began applying fresh, tight bandages. I underestimated Hawthorne, Vienna said quietly as she worked, the intimacy of the quiet garage forcing a confession she would never make in a boardroom. I spent my entire life building an empire, playing chess with ruthless men, thinking I was always 3 moves ahead. I thought money was the ultimate power. She tied off the bandage, her blue eyes meeting his. Today, I learned that all the money in the world can't stop a bullet. You did. Money makes people arrogant, Cullen said, testing the mobility of his newly bandaged arm. Arrogance makes you sloppy. Hawthorne sent 2 men into a confined space without knowing the operational capabilities of his target. That was his mistake. He won't make it again. He stood up, walking over to a large, grease-stained whiteboard hanging on the garage wall. He grabbed a dried-out dry erase marker and drew a crude map of downtown Chicago. It's 4 a.m. on Thursday, Cullen stated, shifting back into the tactical commander. You need to retrieve the encrypted drive from First Metropolitan Bank to take to the DOJ tomorrow morning. Tell me about the security. Vienna crossed her arms, her analytical mind snapping back into focus. First Metropolitan is a fortress. The drive is in a subterranean vault. Access requires my biometric thumbprint, a retinal scan, and a synchronized dual-key turn with the bank manager. The vault is on a time lock. It cannot physically be opened before 9 a.m. Hawthorne knows this? Cullen asked. He knows exactly where I keep my most sensitive files, Vienna confirmed grimly. He will have men watching every entrance of that bank. If we walk through the front doors, we get shot in the lobby, Cullen mused, staring at the whiteboard. If we try to sneak in through the loading docks, we run into an ambush. Hawthorne has the resources to put a dozen PMCs in a 2-block radius. Then it's impossible, Vienna said, despair creeping back into her voice. We can't fight an army, Cullen, even you. We don't have to fight them, Cullen said, a cold, dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. We just have to make them look the wrong way. He turned to Vienna, his eyes sharp. Hawthorne thinks you're a terrified civilian running for your life. He thinks you're hiding. He expects you to try and slip into the bank unnoticed. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we stop playing defense, Cullen said. He walked over to an old steel locker in the back of the garage and cracked the combination lock. Inside was a heavy duffel bag left behind by his old squad mate. Cullen unzipped it, revealing a cache of smoke grenades, heavy body armor, and tactical breaching tools. At 8:55 a.m., we don't sneak into First Metropolitan, Cullen said, tossing a heavy Kevlar vest onto the workbench. We assault it. We use Hawthorne's own tactics against him. We create so much chaos in the financial district that the Chicago Police Department responds with a SWAT element. Hawthorne's PMCs will have to scatter or risk engaging law enforcement in broad daylight. Vienna stared at him, her heart pounding. You want to fake a bank robbery? I want to create a tactical diversion, Cullen corrected. While the police and Hawthorne's men are dealing with a smoke-filled lobby and locked doors, you and I are already in the basement vault pulling the drive. Vienna looked at the heavy armor, then at the sleeping form of Lena. And what about her? We cannot bring a child into a bank heist, Cullen. We won't, Cullen said softly. I'm calling the only person in this city I trust with her life. An old commanding officer. He owes me. He'll keep her secure until we finish this. He walked over to Vienna, closing the distance between them. I promised I'd keep you alive until you hand that evidence over, Ms. Lopez. But doing it my way means walking straight into the fire. Are you ready for that? Vienna Lopez straightened her posture, the fire returning to her eyes. She had been hunted long enough. It was time to become the hunter. Tell me what to do, Commander Patterson, she said. The morning sky over Chicago was the color of bruised iron, spitting freezing rain onto the deserted streets of Pilsen. Inside the garage, Cullen stood by the heavy steel door, waiting. At exactly 6:15 a.m., 3 sharp knocks echoed through the corrugated metal, followed by 2 slow ones. Cullen rolled the door up just enough to let a broad-shouldered man slip inside. It was Arthur Donovan, a retired Marine Sergeant Major who now ran a private security firm out of the suburbs. Donovan had a face like weathered granite and a prosthetic left leg. A souvenir from a firefight in Ramadi, where Cullen had dragged him to safety under heavy machine gun fire. Patterson, Donovan grunted, shaking off the rain. His eyes swept the garage, taking in the stolen truck, the tactical gear, and finally, Vienna Lopez. He didn't ask questions. In their world, a call for help at 4 in the morning meant the explanations could wait until everyone was safe. Cullen gestured to the old leather sofa where Lena was sitting, clutching her winter coat. This is Lena. I need you to take her to your compound in Evanston. Put her in the vault room. Nobody comes in or out until I call you on the encrypted line. Donovan nodded slowly. Consider it done, brother. She's safer with me than she would be at Fort Knox. Cullen knelt in front of his daughter. The tactical commander melted away, leaving only the desperate father. Bug, you're going to go with Mr. Arthur for a little bit, okay? He has a big house with a very friendly golden retriever. Are you coming, Daddy? Lena asked, her lower lip trembling. I have to help Vienna finish her job, Cullen said, his voice thick but steady. But I promise you, I will be there before dinner. We'll get pizza, the good kind with the deep dish. He pulled her into a fierce, crushing hug, memorizing the feeling of her small arms around his neck. Vienna watched from the shadows, a profound respect settling in her chest. She stepped forward as Donovan gently led Lena toward his armored SUV, parked in the alley. Thank you, Vienna whispered to the older Marine. Don't thank me, ma'am, Donovan replied gruffly. Just make sure my boy makes it back in one piece. Once the SUV disappeared into the rain, the atmosphere in the garage shifted. The time for hiding was over. Cullen handed Vienna a lightweight Kevlar vest, showing her how to strap it tight against her ribs. Over the vest, she wore a heavy paramedic's jacket Cullen had scavenged from the locker, concealing her identity beneath a navy blue baseball cap. Cullen mirrored her attire, slinging a canvas medical duffel over his shoulder. Inside the bag were 3 military-grade smoke canisters, zip ties, and the stolen HK-416, broken down into 2 pieces. By 8:45 a.m., the financial district was a swarm of morning commuters, umbrellas blooming like dark mushrooms on the sidewalks. First Metropolitan Bank stood at the corner of LaSalle and Monroe, a monolithic structure of marble and brass. Sitting in the stolen maintenance truck half a block away, Cullen scanned the perimeter through a pair of compact binoculars. 3 men in business suits reading newspapers in the rain, Cullen muttered, pointing to the east entrance. 2 more in a parked utility van near the loading dock. Hawthorne didn't hold back. He has a full perimeter established. If we walk within 50 feet of those doors, they'll make us. So, how do we get inside? Vienna asked, her pulse hammering in her ears. Cullen checked his watch. 8:52 a.m. We don't sneak past them, Cullen said, grabbing the canvas duffel. We blind them. They exited the truck, blending into the sea of commuters. As they approached the subway grate directly adjacent to the bank's primary HVAC intake system, Cullen knelt as if to tie his boot. With practiced sleight of hand, he pulled the pin on a massive M18 violet smoke grenade and rolled it directly into the ventilation shaft. 10 seconds later, the bank's pristine lobby was engulfed in thick, blinding, violent purple smoke. Pandemonium erupted. The bank's internal fire alarms began shrieking, a deafening klaxon that echoed down the block. Commuters screamed, scattering away from the building. The PMCs stationed outside broke their cover, drawing concealed weapons and rushing towards the doors, confused by the sudden chaos. "Keep your head down and follow my shoulders," Cullen ordered, grabbing Vienna's hand. While the mercenaries fought the panicked crowd pouring out of the front doors, Cullen and Vienna slipped through the side maintenance entrance, using the chaos to bypass the distracted security guard. Inside, visibility was zero. The violet smoke choked the air, reducing the opulent bank to a disorienting nightmare. Moving purely on memory and spatial awareness, Cullen led Vienna through the teller floor, vaulting over the marble counter and sprinting toward the basement stairwell. They descended into the subterranean levels, leaving the smoke and the screaming alarms behind them. The heavy steel door to the subterranean vault room stood at the end of a long, fluorescent-lit corridor. Cullen rapidly reassembled the HK-4016 from his duffel, racking the charging handle with a sharp clack. He covered the hallway while Vienna stepped up to the biometric scanner beside the massive circular vault door. "Thumbprint," Vienna said, her voice shaking slightly as she pressed her digit against the glass pad. It beeped green. "Retinal scan." She leaned into the optical reader. Another green beep. She checked her watch. It was exactly 9 out a.m. "The time lock is disengaged," she whispered, grabbing the heavy steel wheel. With Cullen's help, they spun the locking mechanism. The massive gears clanked, and the 2-ton door slowly swung open on its hydraulic hinges. They stepped into the vault. It wasn't empty. Standing in the center of the room, flanked by 2 heavily armed PMCs with their rifles leveled directly at Cullen's chest, was Richard Hawthorne. The chief operating officer wore a tailored suit and a smirk of absolute, terrifying confidence. Sitting on a chair in the corner was the bank manager, bruised and terrified, holding the master override keys. "Good morning, Vienna," Hawthorne said smoothly, his voice echoing in the metallic chamber. "Did you really think a little purple smoke would stop me from claiming what is mine?" The silence in the vault was heavier than the steel walls surrounding them. Cullen stood rigidly in front of Vienna, the muzzle of his rifle aimed center mass at Hawthorne, but the 2 PMCs had him flanked. If he twitched, the crossfire would cut him and Vienna to ribbons. "Drop the weapon, Mr. Patterson," Hawthorne commanded, checking a gold pocket watch. "You put up a valiant fight for a washed-up grunt, but the game is over. If you pull that trigger, my men will execute you both before the shell casing hits the floor." Cullen didn't lower his rifle. His eyes darted between the 2 mercenaries. They were pros, their stances wide, their fingers indexed perfectly on their triggers. But they were arrogant. They had the drop on him, and they thought he was beaten. "You brought mercenaries to a bank vault, Richard," Vienna said, stepping slightly to the side so she wasn't entirely shielded by Cullen. She projected her voice, adopting the icy, commanding tone that terrified boardrooms across the globe. "The Chicago Police SWAT team is currently swarming the lobby above us. The DOJ has been alerted. You can't shoot us and walk out of here." Hawthorne laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "SWAT is dealing with a fire hazard in the lobby. By the time they clear the smoke and secure the perimeter, we will be walking out the subterranean service tunnels with the encrypted drive. Now, open the safety deposit box, Vienna, or I will have them shoot your bodyguard in the kneecaps." "Don't do it," Cullen said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I said drop the gun," Hawthorne shouted, losing his composure. Cullen slowly lowered the barrel of the HK-416, letting it hang by the tactical sling. He raised his left hand in a gesture of surrender. But as his hand went up, his thumb grazed the hidden release buckle of the heavy canvas medical duffel still slung over his shoulder. The bag hit the floor with a heavy thud. Click. Cullen hadn't just packed smoke grenades. In the bottom of the bag, pre-pinned and attached to a tripwire rigged to the zipper, was a military-grade flashbang. "Eyes shut!" Cullen roared, turning away and shoving Vienna hard against the safe deposit boxes. The flashbang detonated with a catastrophic 170-decibel boom, accompanied by a blinding 2 million candle power flash. In the confined metallic echo chamber of the bank vault, the concussion was devastating. Hawthorne and his mercenaries shrieked, dropping to their knees, blinded and utterly disoriented, blood leaking from their eardrums. Cullen didn't waste a microsecond. The OODA loop closed instantly. He spun around, bringing his rifle up. Double tap. The first PMC took 2 rounds to the Kevlar vest, the kinetic impact throwing him backward into the steel wall, knocking him unconscious. Double tap. The second PMC managed to fire wildly into the ceiling before Cullen's rounds struck his weapon, shattering the receiver and driving the mercenary to the floor with a brutal strike from the rifle's heavy stock. Hawthorne was crawling on the marble floor, coughing and clawing at his blinded eyes. Cullen stepped forward, planting his heavy combat boot directly onto the COO's chest, pinning him to the ground. He leveled the smoking barrel of the rifle between Hawthorne's eyes. "Do not move a muscle," Cullen growled. The vault door behind them suddenly banged against its hinges. A dozen tactical flashlights swept into the room, accompanied by the deafening shouts of the Chicago police SWAT team. "Chicago PD, drop the weapon! Drop it now!" Cullen immediately released the rifle, letting it hang on its sling, and put both hands in the air. From behind the wall of SWAT officers, a man in a crisp FBI windbreaker stepped forward, flashing a badge. "Stand down, officers," the agent commanded. He looked at Cullen, then at the groaning mercenaries on the floor. "Arthur Donovan called us. Said we'd find a Marine doing our job for us down here." Vienna pushed herself off the wall, her ears ringing, but her posture entirely unbroken. She walked over to her designated safety deposit box, unlocked it, and pulled out a small, encrypted solid-state drive. She walked over to the FBI agent and placed it in his hand. "Agent," Vienna said, her voice echoing with undeniable authority. "Here is the evidence of international money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The man on the floor is Richard Hawthorne. I suggest you arrest him before I decide to let my security consultant finish the job." Hawthorne was violently hauled to his feet by SWAT officers and dragged out of the vault in handcuffs, his corporate empire collapsing into dust with every step. 1 month later, the winter wind howling off Lake Michigan was just as cold, but Cullen Patterson barely felt it. He stood on the balcony of a beautiful, newly purchased townhome in Lincoln Park, holding a steaming mug of coffee. Inside the warm, sunlit living room, Lena was sitting on the floor, laughing hysterically as she tried to teach a massive golden retriever, a gift from Arthur Donovan, how to shake hands. The door chime rang. Cullen set his coffee down and walked to the foyer, opening the door. Vienna Lopez stood on the porch, wearing a stunning cashmere coat, holding a pastry box from an expensive bakery. She looked rested, powerful, and completely in control of her city once again. Hawthorne and his associates were facing federal indictments, and Lopez Enterprises was soaring. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Vienna said, offering a warm smile that she reserved entirely for him. "Never," Cullen said, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into the living room, immediately kneeling down to hand Lena a powdered croissant. She then stood up and turned to Cullen, pulling a familiar black envelope from her pocket. "The $1 million cleared your account last week," Vienna said softly. But this is something else. Cullen took the envelope and opened it. Inside was an employment contract. Position: Vice President of Global Security Operations, Lopez Enterprises. Salary: blank. I fired my entire security board, Vienna stated, her eyes locking onto his. I need someone who understands strategy, someone who can't be bought, and someone who knows how to survive. I want you, Cullen. Name your price. Cullen looked at the contract, then at his daughter, who was currently covered in powdered sugar and dog hair, perfectly safe, perfectly happy. He looked back at Vienna, the billionaire he had pulled from the fire, who had in turn pulled him from the dark. I have two conditions, Cullen said, a slow smile spreading across his face. I get off at 4 p.m. every day to pick my daughter up from school, and you learn how to make your own truffled mac and cheese. Vienna laughed, a bright, genuine sound that filled the room. Deal, Commander Patterson, deal! If this heart-pounding story of survival, sacrifice, and justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. Share this incredible tale of a single father risking everything to protect a stranger, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more dramatic, real-life inspired stories full of twists and action. Your support helps us bring you more amazing content every single week. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought of Cullen's tactical genius.